And thank you for that beautiful rendition, Hilda. And thank you, Marion. Well, you know, there's been so much said about this brochure, but I want to briefly refer to what we also heard about last night, was very briefly the question of how can we blame Pharaoh if God hardened his heart? And actually, the word hardened has three different total meanings in Hebrew. And it would depend on who is translating the Hebrew into English, which version we hear. So it's very subjective. And I would just like to remind you, there are completely three different nuances of the Hebrew word, also depending which vowels are put in. The first may mean harden, but the actual meaning could be strengthens and ultimately to make heavy. So we did hear last night that actually it was Pharaoh's own complete reliance on the slave for years and years and years. This Pharaoh, and probably the one before him, and a few since the one that recognized Joseph, they had all taken it for granted that they were to have slaves. And once you think like this, which leads you to act like this, as we know, it takes years to change that way of thinking. Hashem cannot go against this because Hashem created the mind to have free will. And I have a friend who always dismisses this and says, don't talk nonsense about how they've been brought up to think or what they've been socialized with. Anyone can change their mind. Not so. If that were the case, and if Hashem could just take control of our minds and we didn't have free will, why did the Jews have to wander, or the Israelites, in the desert for 40 years? Only because they had to get rid of those who could no longer change their mind. So it is very important, as we heard last night, to understand that this is the biblical way of saying that in God's creation of our mind, we have complete free will. However, once we have participated in a thinking and acting or seen it from a child growing up, the majority of people are going to follow and do just that. They will always go with the crowds. So just a few words about this until I turn to a rather different view of a plague. So as we know, Pharaoh didn't change his mind, and that's what is meant by God hardening it. Even at the end, as we know, I better not go ahead for next week, he didn't even change his mind as the Jews were being released. So let's just see if there's anything else to say about this issue. Yes, I found a beautiful analogy to explain what I mean, because it's not that easy. If you look at someone who starts drinking, initially they choose to drink. Then it begins to act on the inhibitory centers of the brain, and while they're under alcohol, they forget about all their problems and aggravation and self-doubts. And what happens when they go on drinking? You and I know that it becomes an addiction. Body and mind are one in the creation. There is no difference. An addiction is a physical phenomenon. So this, I can give you so many examples of this. And it is so important to understand that we should look at our habits and our thoughts and our actions. Where do our thoughts are, who does she think she is, or I'm not good enough? Where does that lead us? Because surely our thoughts, even if we try and hide them, are going to show themselves in an action to our detriment, not to the person we're thinking bad about. So The only other analogy I want to share with you is this, because it's really brilliant. And last night, Rabbi David alluded to it, all the plagues, the way our governments are acting and the way people are acting. But yeah, I also found another thing, and it's amazing. It says here, once a government begins, the head of a government begins, as we had with Zuma, to do something wrong, and other people follow that, and more people follow that, then they begin to hide it, and it gets more and more complicated and more lies. So one lie always leads to another. And so we see this expansion, that it becomes actually part of the entire society. And I'm afraid we've seen that example as well of what started as a thought. Yeah, I can do what I like in this land. Belongs to me and my ancestors, I'll have it. Expand to actually poison most of our society as it has. And yet amongst these, there are always those people like you and like others in our society and in life who have the courage to stand up and talk against the majority. The whole point of that lesson of hardening Pharaoh's heart is to teach us not to conform. And I know there are many non-conformists here, many mavericks and rebels. Trust I'm one. Now, what I thought today we do as well is have a look particularly at that second play. And I'm inspired here by a drosha written, Torah, Nature, and the Love of God. And that drosha by the late Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks and by other rabbis who've had a look at nature, the part that nature plays, not just to give us pleasure when we look at it, but as a confirmation that a higher energy, a higher source, Hashem, exists. So I read to you, the Nile will swarm with frogs, and when they emerge, they will be in your palace, in your bedroom. In fact, they're going to be everywhere, etc., etc. So it is very interesting that the Talmud raises this issue of how nature can serve as a means of coming to a knowledge of God. I mean, that's amazing. Let us consider some of the uses and misuses of the contemplation of nature. Maimonides, in his Sefer HaMitzot, said, the path to love of God through Torah is through Torah learning. Yet, in the foundations of Torah, Maimonides even corrects himself again, and I love it when one of our great sages even corrects himself, because the Jewish debate, the Jewish argument, if you will, the Jewish questioning is the reason that we are still here, that we don't have a blind faith in anything, not even on Hashem, we're allowed to question. So Maimonides says that contemplating the natural world and its awe-inspiring wonders leads one to the love of God. So now, which is more important? To be in nature, to see a tree, to see a beautiful animal, to see a bird, or to study Torah? Now, this is another big debate. And it's actually not only inspiring, it really is fascinating. So Maimonides says, contemplating the natural world also leads to God. The fact that both of these paths are ultimately one. However, which is more important? Torah was the blueprint for the creation of the world, and nature, merely the results of the creation. No. The Ten Commandments, in which the entire Torah is alluded to before it was even written, correspond to the 10 utterances, Asara Ma'asamaros, with which the world was created. Nevertheless, there is a crucial difference between nature and Torah as paths to God. The Midrash says, and you're going to love this, that the Almighty did not create the world with the first letter Aleph, because something more was going to come afterwards, the Torah. But rather with the second letter Bet, which signifies blessing. But to make the Aleph feel better, because the Aleph was very upset, God began the 10 Commandments with an Aleph, Anachi. Isn't that beautiful? You know, Marion, that's like we always say, as you say, that you cover the Torah so it doesn't get upset that we bless the wine first. These almost naive, innocent examples is the heart of our Torah. And it's the innocence with a smile to understand God. So, when it comes to using nature as a path to God, we look at King David, who proclaimed that God is to be found in nature. When I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, I'm inspired to realize my insignificance in relation to God, who is overwhelming. But there is a danger, because we know that by worshipping nature as part of God, we also refer back to an era where the pagans worshipped the sun and the moon, etc., and God was totally forgotten. It's perhaps like that saying about Moses or a prophet pointing to God and telling you what to listen to, and you get stuck on the prophet. I'm not making any allusions to any other religion, but that's why we don't know where Moses was buried, because God didn't want us to get stuck on Moses, but rather what he taught us through Hashem's word. Okay, so the Torah warns us, lest you raise your eyes heavenward and observe the sun, moon, and stars, you are enticed to bow to them. All right, so, and then it's very interesting, they then give us, I then found the observations of 2 astronauts who looked at the world. And funny enough, the Israeli one who went up, you remember, when he saw the world in its perfection, he said, now I've seen everything. There's nothing further than this. Didn't believe in God, which is fine. There are many secular Jews who act the right way. But the American guy, when he went up, looked at the earth and said, this can only be created, this perfection, by a higher source. So once again, we see that you and I have the choice to interpret nature, frogs, beauty, and animal. We have the choice. We can see good or bad in it. So all creation was designed to inspire and lead us to love of God. The Talmud says that on the 5th day of the week, we recite chapter 81 of Psalms, sing out to the God of our strength. Because on the 5th day, guess what? The birds and the fish were created, who also praised God's name by their existence. They might not say it with their own language, but by our seeing them, we can see God in them. We can communicate. Today we can communicate with a whale. That communication, that energy can only be because a higher energy, a higher source created us all. So I think that's so beautiful when we look at nature in this way. So the accessibility of nature to our physical senses is an important addition to our study of the Torah and knowledge of God. As physical beings, we are more affected by what we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell, than only through our intellectual ability to read Torah. So the two are essential, absolutely essential. So let us just say that faith and love of God must be made as real and intense through our senses. Because one who just studies Torah, says all the right things, maybe even does all the right things, but doesn't have that sense of awe, that emotion, that excitement when you look at a beautiful tree. Or for me, and I know for many of you, when I look into the eyes of God's creation, my cat, my dog, and they respond to me. We understand each other. That energy with God, the natural world, and respect and love for each other. I know that those of you who have animals as pets, or have even had a horse or a cow, know that they teach us so many lessons. Mine teach me not to be too possessive, to let go and let God. Look at that beautiful saying, to let them react to me in their way and let me respond. Let us each respect the other with that energy. So may I conclude with this magnificent acknowledgement of God using nature and frogs. And it says in the Torah, we must listen to the lesson that God uses nature to correct wrongs. And so should we. So this new knowledge can give us the strength and courage to fulfill what we know intellectually. By seeking sanctification of God's name represented in nature, the nature senses it. Our pets sense it. An endangered species sense it. May we step ourselves in Torah learning, may we steep ourselves in Torah learning so that in observing the world around us, we can be inspired, encouraged, and strengthened to navigate our faiths, our paths to faith, a love of God, and inspiration to others as a light unto the nation. Shabbat Shalom. Back to you, Marion. Thank you.